Wherever you are right now, let the room grow still. You are standing in the foothills of the northern plains in the spring of 1652, a season still gripped by the long cold of the Maunder minimum, when frost lingers late into the mornings and the ground remembers winter longer than it should. There is nothing you need to remember about this place, and nothing you need to understand about the century it belongs to. Over these hours, hands will select and shape the wood for a home's frame, then work a hide soft and taut across days of quiet stretching, twist sinew into cord, and finally raise the poles and kindle the first fire beneath a new roof. Each task is slow, repetitive, and unhurried. Poles chosen from a stand of lodgepole pine, hide stretched pass by patient pass, thread pulled fiber from fiber. You do not need to follow any of it. Let the sounds of scraping, stretching, and settling wood carry you further from waking for a very long time.
In the spring of 1652, the morning air in the foothills is unusually thin and carries a persistent chill, a lingering breath of the long winters that characterize this middle century of the Little Ice Age. The frost remains white and thick upon the sagebrush, and the ground, still hardened by the sub-zero nights of the Maunder minimum, does not yet yield to the weight of a moccasined foot. The sun rises as a pale, distant disk, casting long and low-intensity shadows across the rocky slopes where the parkland begins its transition into the western coniferous forests. In this quiet space, the only movement is the steady, rhythmic puff of breath from the man and his dogs, visible as small clouds of mist that dissipate slowly in the still, cold air. There is a profound silence in the forest, broken only by the occasional high-pitched chirp of a prairie dog alert to the passing travelers, or the distant muffled sound of a stream carrying the first melt of the high alpine glaciers. The man moves with a measured pace, his eyes tracing the vertical lines of the trees, looking for the specific straightness required for the bones of a new home. Beside him, the dogs move with tails low, their fur occasionally rimmed with a fine glaze of frost from the damp undergrowth they navigate. There is no rush in this journey. The selection of the wood is a task that occupies the full span of the morning, governed by the slow requirement of finding poles that are neither too heavy for the dogs to pull, nor too weak to stand against the western winds. The search concludes at a dense stand of lodgepole pine, where the trees grow in such close proximity that they have been forced to stretch upward, straight and slender, shedding their lower branches in the competition for light. These trees, known in the language of the people as standing people, possess a grain that is tight and resilient, capable of withstanding the immense pressure of a hide cover and the seasonal loads of heavy snow. The man approaches a single tree, his hand resting briefly on the rough, grayish-brown bark, feeling the cold texture of the wood beneath. He selects poles that are between 3 and 4 inches in diameter at the base, tapering to a fine point over the length of nearly 20 feet. Each choice is deliberate, ensuring the set of 15 to 20 poles will be uniform in weight and flexibility. Before the first strike, a small offering of tobacco is placed at the roots, a quiet acknowledgement of the life being taken and the service the tree will provide as a protector of the family. The scent of the forest at this moment is a complex layering of damp earth, the sharp, cold smell of pine needles, and the faint, sweet aroma of the sap beginning to stir deep within the trunk. The thought of the man is clear and slow. He considers the weight of the wood and the strength of the sinew he carries in his pouch. There is a calm certainty in the work, a recognition that the home begins here, in the shadow of the mountain and the stillness of the wood. The felling begins not with the ringing bite of modern steel, but with the dull, resonant thud of a stone celt and the sharp, short strokes of a French Biscay trade axe. The stone tool, a finely polished blade of basalt lashed to a wooden handle with wet sinew and reinforced with pine pitch, does not cut so much as it fractures the vertically oriented fibers of the wood. Each strike is short and precise, delivered at a steep angle to the stem, creating a rhythmic tuk, tuk, tuk that echoes softly through the trees. The iron trade axe, an egg-shaped head without a pole, is used for the finer work, its blade thin and capable of slicing through the sapwood where the stone tool might only crush. The man works with a steady cadence, his movements mimicking the slow, deep breathing of a long-distance traveler, never overexerting, allowing the weight of the tool to do the primary work. As the blade enters the wood, a fresh, citrusy scent of limonene and alpha-pinene is released, a bright contrast to the heavy, loamy smell of the forest floor. The wood is green and full of moisture, making each strike sound wet and heavy, a tactile vibration that travels up the handle and into the man's palms. Small chips of pale wood fall into the frost-covered grass, and the internal monologue of the man remains centered on the task. The tree must fall exactly where the ground is flat to avoid breaking the slender tip. The moment of failure is marked by a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of the heartwood finally giving way, followed by the long, rushing sigh of the branches passing through the air and the soft, muffled thud as the pole meets the earth. Once the tree is down, the long and repetitive process of stripping the bark begins, a task that requires a different kind of patience and a finer set of tools. Using a bone scraper fashioned from the leg bone of a bison or a smoothed piece of chert, the man begins to peel away the protective outer layer. The sound is a long, continuous hiss, a shh that follows the length of the pole as the tool slides beneath the bark and lifts it in long, curling strips. The inner surface of the bark is cool and slippery, coated in a sweet, mucilaginous substance that the people sometimes consume for nourishment in these lean spring months. As the bark is removed, the pale, wet heartwood is exposed, glistening with a thin film of sap that is incredibly sticky to the touch. The resin clings to the man's fingers like a thick glue, its scent becoming more intense, a heavy resinous odor that is both woody and sweet. He works from the base toward the tip, carefully removing every knot and branch stub with the iron hatchet until the surface is as smooth as a river stone. This smoothness is essential. It ensures that when the rains come, the water will flow down the pole to the ground rather than dripping into the center of the teepee. The sun has moved higher now, and its warmth begins to dry the surface of the wood, causing the sap to harden and the pale color to shift toward a light amber. The repetition of the scraping motion becomes a form of meditation, the rhythmic movement of the arm and the steady hiss of the bone on wood, creating a quiet sanctuary of work within the vastness of the foothills. The final task of the day is the assembly of the dog travail for the long journey back to the camp. 2 of the newly prepared poles are selected to form the A-frame, their tips lashed together with thick buffalo sinew that has been softened in water. The man wraps the apex of the frame in soft buffalo skin to protect the dog's shoulders from friction burns, securing the harness with leather straps that have been treated with fat to remain supple in the cold. The dogs stand patiently, their breath still misting, as the weight is distributed. A single dog can pull between 20 and 30 kilograms over the native grasslands. As the procession begins to move, the splayed ends of the poles drag across the prairie, making a nearly silent, sweeping sound as they pass over the dry grasses. This sound is unlike the cracking of a wheel. It is a soft, rhythmic shh, whisk that harmonizes with the jingle of the harness and the soft padding of the dog's paws on the earth. The travail floats over the uneven terrain, the long poles providing leverage that allows the dogs to navigate gullies and slopes with a steady, unhurried gait. The man walks beside them, his hand occasionally resting on the load to steady it, his thoughts turning to the camp where the women will continue the work of seasoning and polishing the wood. The shadows are lengthening once more, and the air begins to sharpen with the coming frost of the evening. The poles, the first pieces of the new house, move slowly across the vast open horizon, a steady and unchanging flow of time under the endless sky. The return to the winter-weary camp is marked by the low, rhythmic thumping of dog paws against the thawing earth of the early 1650s prairie. As the dogs draw the travois through the tall, dried grasses of the previous season, the splayed ends of the lodgepole pine poles leave shallow, parallel grooves in the soil, a temporary map of the family's movement across the foothills. The air in the camp carries a different weight than the forest, thick with the scent of smoldering buffalo dung and the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke that has settled into the very fibers of the hide lodges. The man leads the team toward a flat clearing on the edge of the circle, where the sun strikes the ground with a pale, unblinking intensity, its light lacking the warmth of late summer, but providing enough clarity to see the fine details of the work ahead. He moves with a quiet efficiency, unbuckling the rawhide harnesses and allowing the dogs to shake the frost and dust from their heavy coats. The poles are slid from the frames and laid side by side on a bed of dry sage, their fresh, pale wood contrasting sharply with the dark, weathered colors of the existing camp. There is no urgency in these movements. The seasoning of the wood is a dialogue between the tree and the wind that will take many days to complete. He rests his hand once more on a pole, feeling the cold, damp surface of the wood, knowing that the journey from standing person to the bone of the home has only just begun. In this transitional season of the Maunder minimum, the sap of the lodgepole pine is thick and viscous, acting as a slow-moving lifeblood that remains tacky to the touch long after the tree has been felled. As the man begins the secondary scraping, his fingers become coated in a layer of clear golden resin that is both protein and aromatic, a substance that clings to the skin with the tenacity of glue. The texture is initially slick and cool, like a thick oil, but as the air works upon it, the resin becomes draggy and stiff, catching on the fine hairs of his hands and leaving a sweet, resinous scent that will remain for many days. He observes the way the sap bubbles slightly at the cut ends of the poles, a slow-motion exudation of terpenes, alpha-pinene and limonene, that fills the immediate workspace with a sharp, citrusy freshness. To manage the stickiness, he occasionally rubs his palms with a handful of fine, dry silt or the powdery white yeast found on the bark of nearby aspen trees, a repetitive gesture that turns the tacky resin into a dry, workable crust. The thought arises that this sap is the tree's own medicine, a protective barrier against the biting insects and fungal rot of the foothills, and now it serves as the first layer of protection for the home. The stickiness is not an inconvenience, but a tactile confirmation of the wood's youth and strength, a granular detail in the long, unchanging flow of the spring afternoon. The man takes up a long, curved scraper fashioned from the rib of an old buffalo bull, its edges ground down on a river stone until they are as smooth and hard as glass. He seats himself on the ground, the length of a 20-foot pole resting across his lap, and begins the long, rhythmic task of removing the inner cambium layer. The sound of the bone against the green wood is a steady, rasping hiss, a whisk that repeats every 2 arm lengths, the cadence of the stroke mimicking the slow, deep breathing of a man at rest. As the bone edge bites into the wood, it lifts the final remnants of the inner bark in long, curling, translucent shavings that fall to the earth like pale ribbons. This inner layer, often sweet and moisture-rich in the spring, is scraped away until the heartwood is exposed, revealing a surface that is white, profane, and subtly dimpled. The resistance of the wood varies. Near the knots where branches once grew, the bone scraper must be angled more steeply, the sound shifting from a hiss to a low rhythmic thrum as it passes over the dense, swirled grain. He works from the butt toward the tip, his eyes following the edge of the tool as it reveals the hidden geometry of the tree. Each stroke is a lesson in the tree's history, a tactile exploration of the years of growth captured in the tight, cold rings of the 17th century forest. To ensure the poles are perfectly smooth, a necessity for directing rain away from the interior of the lodge, the man uses a handful of coarse sandstone gathered from the dry creek beds. The tactile sensation is of intense friction and heat as he rubs the stone against the lodgepole. The rough grit breaks down into a fine gray powder, filling the air with a faint mineral smell. The sound is a low-frequency grinding, a granular shh that vibrates through the wood and into his chest. a repetitive and hypnotic noise that masks the distant sounds of the camp. He focuses on the areas where the Biscay iron axe had trimmed away the branches, smoothing the stubs until they are flush with the trunk, ensuring there are no protrusions to catch the hide cover or create a dripping point for rainwater. The wood begins to lose its raw, fibrous look, taking on a polished sheen that reflects the low-intensity light of the sun. Under his touch, the pole becomes cool and sleek, the surface tension so low that a drop of water would slide down its length without interruption. He thinks of the rain that will surely come, the sudden spring storms of the Little Ice Age, and how these poles must shed the moisture to keep the children dry and warm beneath the buffalo skins. This smoothing is the final refinement of the bones, a task that bridges the gap between the wild forest and the domestic sanctuary.
Without the use of graduated scales, the man measures the poles against the only constants he knows, the reach of his own arms and the span of his hands. He stands at the base of a pole, extending his arms in a full cubit reach, marking the 20-foot length by the repetition of his own body's dimensions. He checks the diameter at the crossing point, ensuring it is no wider than 4 fingers, a thickness that allows for a tight, stable crossing at the apex of the teepee. The taper of the lodgepole is natural, but he verifies it by sliding his hand along the length, feeling the gradual narrowing from the 3-inch butt to the slender, flexible tip. These measurements are not technical, but personal, a way of ensuring the home is built to the scale of the humans who will inhabit it. He considers the balance of the 15 poles, selecting the 3 strongest for the foundation tripod, the ones that will bear the primary burden of the wind and the weight of the skins. Each pole is marked with a small notch near the tie point, a quiet preparation for the day when the family will raise the structure together. The thought is calm. The house is already present in the proportions of the wood, waiting only for the final curing and the lashing of the sinew to become a reality.
The final processing requires the poles to be stood upright, leaning in a tight cluster against a sturdy tripod or the crotch of a high tree, where the air can circulate freely around each trunk. In this vertical position, the remaining moisture in the green wood begins to migrate, pulled downward by gravity and drawn outward by the dry, anticyclonic winds of the northern plains. Every morning, as the frost begins to melt into the soil, the man goes to the poles and gives each one a deliberate quarter turn. This repetitive action ensures that the sun's drying effect is distributed evenly, preventing the slender poles from warping or bowing under their own weight. The sound of the poles shifting against one another is a dry wooden clack, followed by a long, low creak as they settle into their new positions. Over the days, the pale white of the fresh pine begins to darken, shifting toward a light amber or a soft, weathered gray as the resin cures within the grain. The wood becomes harder and significantly lighter, losing the green weight that would have exhausted the dogs on a long march. He watches the shadows of the poles lengthen across the camp floor, a sundial of the season's progress, knowing that when the wood is dry enough to ring with a clear, sharp note when struck, the bones will be ready for the skin. There is no need to rise yet. The seasoning will take as long as the sky requires, and in this gray space between the work and the completion, he is content.
The hide preparation begins in the shallow depression dug near the edge of the thawing creek, a basin lined with smooth river stones and packed clay to hold water without seepage. The morning light is pale and diffused, filtering through a thin veil of cirrus clouds that stretch across the sky like polled wool. The air remains cool, carrying the damp mineral scent of wet stone and the faint earthy aroma of decaying willow leaves along the bank. A single hide is lowered into the water, its weight distributing slowly across the surface before sinking beneath. The water is cold, drawn directly from the creek, and it immediately begins to draw out the residual stiffness from the cured pelt. There is a quiet, muffled sound as the material settles, a soft exhalation of trapped air that rises in small silver bubbles. The man kneels on the grassy bank, his hands resting on his knees, observing the gradual saturation. He does not hurry. The soaking is a passive process, one that relies entirely on time and temperature. He dips his fingers into the water, feeling the chill seep into his joints, a familiar sensation that marks the season. The hide rests in the basin, its edges slowly lifting as it absorbs the moisture, becoming heavier and more pliable with each passing hour. The surrounding prairie is still, broken only by the distant call of a red-winged blackbird and the low hum of wind passing through dry grass. The man watches the water level settle, noting how the surface remains undisturbed except for the slow ripple caused by the settling material. He thinks of the long days ahead, recognizing that the transformation of this pelt will not be achieved through force, but through patience and repeated gentle intervention. The water will remain in contact with the hide for 2 full days, allowing the fibers to relax and return to a state that can accept the work of the scraper. There is no need to stir or adjust it yet. The basin holds the weight steadily, and the cool temperature prevents any premature fermentation. The man stands slowly, brushing a fine layer of dust from his knees, and walks back toward the camp to prepare the stretching frame. The work will wait for him, steady and unchanging, just as it has waited for generations. The basin itself is a simple construction, shaped by hands and time rather than precise measurements. The walls slope gently inward, packed tight with clay and lined with flat stones to prevent the water from washing away the banks during spring rains. The water within is clear, reflecting the pale sky and the slow drift of cottonwood seeds that float on the surface. When the hide was first placed, it floated lightly, but as the fibers absorbed the moisture, it sank to rest against the stone floor. The man returns in the late afternoon to check the progress. He reaches into the basin, his fingers sliding under the edge of the pelt. the texture has already shifted. The stiff, cured surface has softened into something yielding and cool. He lifts a section slightly, allowing water to drain back into the pool with a steady dripping sound. The droplets fall in a rhythmic pattern, each one striking the surface with a clear, hollow tone. He does not pull or stretch the material at this stage. The goal is uniform hydration, ensuring that every section, from the thick shoulder area to the thinner flank, receives equal saturation. The water remains cold, a necessary condition that preserves the structural integrity of the fibers while preventing bacterial growth. He notes the slight change in color, the deep brown of the cured side lightening to a muted, earthy tone as the water penetrates the grain. The scent is clean and neutral, carrying only the faint mineral quality of the creek and the natural, unprocessed odor of the pelt itself.
He allows the material to settle back into the basin, watching the ripples gradually fade into stillness. The evening air begins to cool further, and a light mist forms over the water, drifting upward like breath. The man steps back, satisfied with the even distribution of moisture. He knows that tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same quiet observation, the same steady passage of time. The basin will hold the hide until it is ready, and he will return to it when the fibers have fully relaxed. There is a quiet certainty in this waiting, a recognition that the material dictates the pace, not the worker. The camp settles into evening stillness, and the only sound is the slow, consistent dripping from the basin's edge, marking the passage of another day. As the third day approaches, the hide reaches the proper state of saturation. The man returns to the basin in the early morning when the air is crisp and the frost has just begun to melt into the soil. He kneels beside the pool and lifts the pelt slowly, supporting its full weight with both hands. It is heavy, cool, and thoroughly softened, yielding easily to the pressure of his fingers without resistance or stiffness. He carries it to a flat, grassy area near the camp, laying it out with the grain side facing upward. The surface is smooth and damp, reflecting the low morning light with a subtle sheen. He runs his palms across the material, feeling the uniform softness that has replaced the initial rigidity. The water has done its work, opening the fiber structure and preparing the pelt for the next phase. He takes a shallow wooden tray filled with clean, cool water and gently rinses the surface, removing any residual particles or dust that may have settled during the soaking process. The sound of the water pouring over the hide is soft and continuous, a gentle cascade that washes across the grain and pools in the natural depressions. He uses his hands to guide the flow, ensuring that the entire surface is evenly rinsed. The temperature of the water matches the ambient air, preventing any sudden contraction of the fibers. After rinsing, he allows the hide to drain for a few moments, then carefully folds it in half, aligning the edges with precision. He places it on a clean, dry surface to rest, giving the fibers a brief period to adjust before the physical work begins. The thought arises naturally that this preparation is the foundation of all that follows, a quiet acknowledgement that the material must be ready before the tools can be applied.
He sits beside the folded pelt, watching the slow evaporation of surface moisture, feeling the steady rhythm of the morning settle into place. The camp around him is quiet, the only movement coming from the gentle breeze that stirs the edges of nearby hide lodges. He does not rush to the next step. He waits, allowing the hide to reach the exact consistency required for the scraper. The air grows slightly warmer as the sun climbs higher, and the damp surface begins to lose its initial chill. When the time is right, he will unfold it and begin the long, repetitive process of fleshing. Until then, he remains still, observing the quiet transition from preparation to action.
The stretching frame is constructed from two parallel wooden beams, each roughly 6 feet in length, secured at each end by cross braces lashed with rawhide cords. The beams are smooth, worn from years of use, and carry the faint, polished sheen of countless hours of contact with pelt and tool. The hide is unfolded and centered on the frame, its edges pulled taut and secured with wooden pegs driven through pre-punched holes along the perimeter. The tension is applied gradually, starting from the center and working outward, ensuring that the material remains evenly stretched without distortion. The sound of the pegs being driven into the wood is a dull, rhythmic thud, each strike measured and deliberate. The man sits on a low wooden stool beside the frame, positioning himself so that the pelt lies flat and accessible. He picks up the fleshing tool, a heavy, curved blade fashioned from the rib bone of a mature animal, its edge honed to a smooth, continuous curve through repeated sharpening on river stone. The tool feels solid in his hand, balanced and familiar, its weight distributed evenly along the grip. He places the blade against the inner surface of the hide, angling it slightly to follow the natural curve of the pelt. The first stroke is slow, applying steady pressure as the bone edge glides across the damp fibers. The sound is a quiet, continuous hiss, a soft scraping that moves along the length of the material. The blade removes a thin layer of residual tissue and moisture, leaving behind a cleaner, more uniform surface. The man works in long, overlapping strokes, moving from the center toward the edges, his arm extending fully with each pass before returning to the starting point. The rhythm is steady, mimicking the slow, deep breathing of a person at rest. There is no force, only consistent pressure and controlled motion. The hide responds gradually, the fibers tightening slightly under the tension of the frame, while the inner surface becomes smoother with each pass. The air around the workspace remains cool, carrying the faint, damp scent of wet hide and polished bone. The man pauses occasionally to wipe the blade with a soft cloth, removing the accumulated residue before continuing. His thoughts remain centered on the movement, the alignment of the tool, the evenness of the stroke. He does not look at the distant horizon or the passing clouds. His focus is entirely on the immediate surface, the tactile feedback traveling from the blade through his hand and up his arm. The work continues in this manner for hours, the repetitive motion creating a quiet, hypnotic rhythm that fills the space. The frame holds steady, the pegs remain secure, and the hide gradually transforms under the steady pressure of the bone scraper. There is no urgency, only the continuous, unchanging flow of the task. The second pass with the scraper begins after a brief rest, allowing the hide to adjust to the tension and the tool to be cleaned and repositioned. The man shifts slightly on his stool, adjusting his posture to maintain a comfortable angle for the next set of strokes. The hide now feels firmer, the initial moisture having been worked out, and the fibers settling into their stretched position. He places the blade against the surface once more, applying the same steady pressure, but with a slightly different angle to ensure complete coverage. The sound remains consistent, a soft, rhythmic hiss that repeats with every full extension of the arm. The bone edge catches lightly on any remaining uneven areas, lifting them away in thin, translucent layers that curl gently before falling to the ground. The residue is minimal at this stage, consisting mostly of fine, damp particles that blend into the soil beneath the frame. The man works methodically, section by section, ensuring that no area is overlooked. He moves from the broad shoulder region to the narrower flank, adjusting the pressure to match the varying thickness of the pelt. The thicker sections require slightly more force, but the movement remains smooth and controlled. The frame creaks occasionally as the tension shifts, a low wooden sound that blends seamlessly with the scraping rhythm. The air remains cool, and the hide retains a slight dampness that prevents the fibers from drying too quickly and becoming brittle. The man's hands move with practiced ease, the muscles in his forearm engaging only enough to maintain the blade's alignment. He does not fight the material, he guides it, allowing the tool to do the work, while his hands provide steady direction. The thought arises that this phase is less about removal and more about alignment, a process of evening out the surface so that it will accept the subsequent treatments evenly. He pauses to inspect the progress, running his fingers lightly over the scraped area. The texture is uniform, smooth and cool to the touch, with a subtle sheen that reflects the morning light. He returns to the stool and continues, the rhythm unbroken, the strokes steady and precise. The hours pass without notice, marked only by the gradual lightening of the hide's inner surface and the soft, continuous sound of bone on wet fibers. The camp remains quiet, the work proceeding in its own unhurried time. The final scraping pass focuses on refinement and consistency. The man moves to the outer edges of the frame where the hide is slightly thinner and more responsive to light pressure. The blade glides across the surface with minimal resistance, producing a softer, whisper-like sound that contrasts with the deeper hiss of the earlier strokes. He pays close attention to the transitions between sections, ensuring that there are no abrupt changes in texture or thickness. The hide now feels fully prepared, the inner surface smooth and even, the fibers aligned and ready for the next stage.
He sets the scraper aside and runs both hands over the entire surface, feeling for any remaining irregularities. The tactile feedback is consistent across the pelt, a uniform coolness that confirms the evenness of the work. He adjusts a few pegs along the edge, tightening the tension slightly to prepare for the drying phase. The sound of the pegs shifting in the wood is a quiet wooden click, followed by the soft rustle of the hide settling into its new position. The sun has moved higher, casting a pale, even light across the workspace. The air remains cool, but the surface of the hide begins to lose its dampness, drying slowly under the steady breeze. The man sits back, observing the gradual transformation. The hide no longer feels like raw material. It has taken on a structured, deliberate quality, shaped by time and repetition. He thinks of the next steps, knowing that the stretching and drying will require similar patience, similar attention to detail. There is no rush to move forward. He allows the hide to rest, letting the fibers adjust to the tension and the surface dry naturally. The frame stands steady, the pegs secure, the workspace quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the camp. The man remains seated, his hands resting in his lap, watching the slow, steady passage of the morning. The work is complete for now, and the hide will continue to settle in its own time. He knows that when it is ready, the next phase will begin, just as this one did, with patience, repetition, and quiet attention. The stretching process begins once the hide has dried sufficiently to hold tension without excessive moisture. The man removes the wooden pegs along the perimeter, allowing the hide to relax slightly before repositioning it for the next phase. He works from the center outward, pulling the material taut and securing it again with fresh pegs placed at regular intervals. The tension is applied evenly, ensuring that the hide remains flat and free from wrinkles or distortions. The sound of the pegs being driven is steady and rhythmic, each strike measured to avoid splitting the wood or tearing the hide. He moves around the frame, adjusting the tension as needed, his hands working with a calm, deliberate precision. The hide responds to the pull, the fibers aligning further, and the surface becoming smoother under the even pressure. The man takes a second, heavier stretching tool, a long wooden pole with a rounded, smooth end, and places it against the inner surface. He presses the pole firmly against the hide, rolling it slowly from the center toward the edge. The sound is a deep, muffled thud, followed by a soft, sliding noise as the pole moves across the material. The rolling action compresses the fibers further, ensuring that the tension is distributed uniformly across the entire surface. He repeats this motion in overlapping passes, working in straight lines that intersect at the center. The rhythm is consistent, the pressure steady, the movement unhurried. The hide gradually takes on a more defined shape, the edges pulling taut and the surface becoming completely flat. The air remains cool and the hide retains a slight flexibility, allowing the fibers to adjust without becoming brittle. The man pauses to inspect the progress, running his fingers lightly over the surface to check for any remaining uneven areas. The texture is uniform, smooth and cool, with a subtle firmness that indicates the fibers are properly aligned. He continues the rolling process, moving to the next section, maintaining the same steady rhythm. The frame holds the tension securely, the pegs remain in place, and the work proceeds in its own quiet time. There is no need to rush. The hide will stretch and settle as it is meant to, guided by repetition and consistent pressure. The camp remains still, the only sounds coming from the wooden pole moving across the hide and the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. The man works steadily, his focus entirely on the task, his movements calm and measured. The second phase of stretching focuses on the edges and corners, areas that require slightly more attention due to their natural tendency to contract. The man repositions the wooden pole, adjusting his stance to reach the outer perimeter of the hide. He applies the rolling motion with a slightly lighter touch, ensuring that the tension remains even without overstressing the thinner sections. The sound is softer here, a gentle, sliding thud that moves along the edge of the frame. He works methodically, section by section, moving from one corner to the next, his hands guiding the pole with steady, controlled movements. The hide responds gradually, the fibers stretching evenly, and the surface becoming completely flat across the entire area. He pauses occasionally to check the tension, pressing lightly with his fingertips to feel for any areas that may be too loose or too tight. Adjustments are made by shifting the pegs slightly, allowing the hide to settle into its new position before continuing. The rhythm remains consistent, the pressure steady, the movement unhurried. The air around the workspace remains cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of drying hide and polished wood. The man's hands move with practiced ease, the muscles in his arms engaging only enough to maintain the pole's alignment. He does not force the material, he guides it, allowing the tension to distribute naturally. The thought arises that this phase is about balance, a quiet process of ensuring that the hide will hold its shape without warping or distorting over time. He pauses to inspect the progress, running his hands over the surface once more. The texture is uniform, firm and smooth, with no visible irregularities. He returns to the edge and continues, the rhythm unbroken, the strokes steady and precise. The hours pass without notice, marked only by the gradual tightening of the hide and the soft, continuous sound of the wooden pole moving across the surface. The camp remains quiet, the work proceeding in its own unhurried time.
The final stretching pass ensures complete uniformity across the entire hide. The man moves to the central area, where the fibers have settled into their final position under the even tension. He uses the wooden pole with a lighter touch, applying short, controlled strokes that compress the surface without adding excessive pressure. The sound is a soft, rhythmic tapping, followed by a quiet sliding noise as the pole moves across the material. He works in a circular pattern, starting from the center and moving outward, ensuring that every section receives equal attention. The hide responds with a subtle firmness, the fibers fully aligned and the surface completely flat. He sets the pole aside and runs both hands over the entire area, feeling for any remaining inconsistencies. The tactile feedback is even,
a uniform coolness and firmness that confirms the success of the stretching process. He adjusts a few pegs along the perimeter, tightening the tension slightly to lock the hide into its final shape. The sound of the pegs shifting is a quiet wooden click, followed by the soft rustle of the hide settling into place. The sun has moved higher, casting a pale, even light across the workspace. The air remains cool, but the surface of the hide begins to lose its residual moisture, drying slowly under the steady breeze. The man sits back, observing the gradual transformation. The hide no longer feels like raw material. It has taken on a structured, deliberate quality, shaped by time, tension, and repetition.
He thinks of the next steps, knowing that the application of fat and the smoking process will require similar patience, similar attention to detail. There is no rush to move forward. He allows the hide to rest, letting the fibers adjust to the final tension and the surface dry naturally. The frame stands steady, the pegs secure, the workspace quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the camp. The man remains seated, his hands resting in his lap, watching the slow, steady passage of the morning. The work is complete for now, and the hide will continue to settle in its own time. He knows that when it is ready, the next phase will begin, just as this one did, with patience, repetition, and quiet attention.
The morning begins in the cool, still air of the spring camp, where the ground retains the damp chill of the previous night's frost. The workspace is arranged on a flat, sun-warmed area near the edge of the lodge circle, sheltered from the direct wind by a low arrangement of stacked firewood and dried sage bundles. A shallow wooden basin sits at the center, filled with clear water drawn from the nearby creek. The water is cold, holding the steady temperature of the melting snowpack, and its surface remains undisturbed except for the occasional drift of cottonwood seeds. Submerged within the basin are several bundles of dried bison backstrap sinew, pale and fibrous, resting against the smooth river stones at the bottom. The man kneels beside the basin, his hands resting on his knees, observing the slow process of rehydration. There is no urgency in the preparation. The transformation of dry tendon into workable thread requires time, patience, and the quiet absorption of moisture. He reaches into the water, his fingers brushing against the dense, overlapping strands. The sinew feels stiff at first, resistant and unyielding, but as the cold water penetrates the tightly packed fibers, it begins to soften, releasing a faint, earthy scent reminiscent of dry grass and aged wood. He lifts a single bundle, allowing the water to drain in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The droplets fall back into the basin with clear, hollow tones, each one marking the passage of another quiet moment. The fibers, once brittle and chalky, now carry a slight pliability, yielding gently to the pressure of his thumb. He separates a few strands from the main bundle, laying them across a flat piece of cured hide to begin the slow process of splitting and twisting.
The air around the workspace remains still, carrying only the distant, low hum of wind moving through the tall grasses and the occasional soft call of a meadowlark. The thought arises naturally that this thread, born from the same animal that will provide the shelter's walls, carries a quiet continuity, a material memory that will hold the seams together for years. There is no need to force the fibers. They will separate and align as they absorb the water, guided only by steady hands and the slow passage of the morning.
The splitting of the sinew requires a controlled, deliberate motion. The man selects a smooth, flat stone with a slightly rounded edge, positioning it beside the damp strands. He places the tip of his fingernail beneath a single fiber and applies gentle, consistent pressure, coaxing it away from the surrounding bundle. The sound is quiet, almost imperceptible, a soft, dry whisper as the fibers slide apart, followed by the faint rustle of moisture being displaced. He repeats this motion, working his way down the length of the strand, his hands moving with a calm, unhurried precision. The sinew begins to take on a finer, more uniform texture, each split strand revealing a pale, translucent quality that catches the low morning light. He does not pull or stretch the material excessively. The goal is to maintain the structural integrity of the fibers while achieving a consistent thickness suitable for threading. The tactile feedback is steady. The damp sinew feels cool and slightly resilient, offering gentle resistance before yielding to the separation. He lays the split strands side by side, aligning them carefully to ensure uniformity before the twisting phase begins. The workspace remains quiet, the only movement coming from the slow evaporation of surface moisture and the gradual warming of the air as the sun climbs higher. The man's hands continue their methodical work, each separation adding to the growing pile of prepared thread. He considers the weight of the hides that will eventually be joined, recognizing that the strength of the seam depends entirely on the evenness of this preparation. There is no rush to complete the task. The sinew will absorb the moisture fully, and the fibers will align themselves through repetition and gentle handling. The rhythm of the splitting becomes a quiet anchor, a steady pulse that matches the slow breathing of the camp.
Once the strands have been split to the desired thickness, the twisting process begins. The man takes two parallel strands, laying them across his palm, and begins to roll them slowly between his thumb and fingers. The motion is continuous and even, applying just enough pressure to encourage the fibers to wrap around each other without over-tightening. The sound is a soft, rhythmic friction, a quiet shh, shh, that repeats with every rotation. As the strands twist together, they form a single cohesive thread, pale and slightly glossy from the retained moisture. He works steadily, extending the twisted length by adding new segments to the end, ensuring that each junction is seamless and secure. The tactile sensation is consistent. The thread feels firm yet flexible, capable of holding tension without snapping. He occasionally dips his fingers into the basin to rehydrate any sections that begin to dry, maintaining an even moisture level throughout the process.
The thread grows longer with each pass, coiling loosely in a shallow wooden tray as it is completed. The air around the workspace remains cool, but carries a faint warmth from the morning sun, which now strikes the ground with a pale, even intensity. The man's hands move without hesitation, the muscles in his forearms engaging only enough to maintain the steady rotation. He pauses occasionally to inspect the consistency of the twist, running his fingers lightly along the length of the thread to check for uneven spots or loose fibers. The texture is uniform, smooth and cool, with a subtle firmness that confirms the even distribution of moisture and tension. He thinks of the long seams that will be stitched, the repetitive motion of the awl and thread, the gradual joining of separate hides into a single continuous shell. There is no urgency, only the quiet certainty that the thread will hold, just as the poles will stand, just as the camp will endure. The workspace remains still, the coiled thread resting in the tray, waiting for the next phase to begin. The prepared hides are laid out in a wide, overlapping arrangement across the flat, grassy area near the camp's edge. Each hide has been stretched, dried, and treated, its surface smooth and cool to the touch, carrying the faint, clean scent of aged leather and dried sage. The man moves slowly around the arrangement, his steps quiet and deliberate, his eyes tracing the curved edges where the hides will be joined. He selects two adjacent pieces, aligning their natural contours so that the thicker shoulder region of one meets the thinner flank of the next. The goal is not perfect symmetry, but a seamless transition that will distribute tension evenly across the entire seam. He places his hands on the overlapping edges, pressing gently to test the fit. The leather yields slightly under his palms, conforming to the pressure without resistance. The texture is uniform, firm, and cool, with a subtle sheen that reflects the low morning light. He adjusts the alignment by a fraction of an inch, sliding the upper hide slightly forward to ensure that the grain direction runs consistently across the joint. The sound of the leather moving against itself is soft and muffled, a quiet shh rustle that fades quickly into the still air. The surrounding prairie remains undisturbed, the tall grasses swaying gently in the light breeze, carrying the faint mineral scent of dry soil and distant creek water. The man does not rush to secure the hides in place. He allows the natural weight of the material to settle, observing how the edges rest against one another, how the overlapping sections create a smooth, uninterrupted line. He considers the wind that will press against the finished shelter, the way the seams must hold without buckling or tearing under sustained pressure. There is a quiet certainty in this preparation, a recognition that the strength of the structure begins with the careful alignment of its individual parts. He steps back, his hands resting lightly at his sides, watching the slow passage of clouds across the pale sky. The work will proceed in its own time, guided by repetition, attention, and the steady rhythm of the morning.
The second phase of alignment focuses on securing the edges with temporary weights to prevent shifting during the stitching process. The man gathers a series of smooth, flat stones from a nearby pile, each one carefully selected for its uniform weight and rounded edges. He places the stones along the overlapping seams, spacing them at regular intervals to maintain consistent tension without distorting the leather.
The sound of the stones settling onto the hides is a dull, muffled thud, each impact absorbed by the dense, cured material. He moves methodically along the entire length of the joint, adjusting the placement of each stone to ensure that the edges remain flush and evenly aligned. The tactile feedback is steady. The leather feels firm beneath the weight, the stones pressing gently into the surface without causing indentation or creasing. He runs his fingers along the seam, feeling for any irregularities or gaps that may have formed during the placement. The texture is uniform, smooth, and cool, with no visible disruptions along the joint. The air around the workspace remains still, carrying only the faint scent of dried leather and the quiet warmth of the morning sun. The man's hands continue their careful work, each adjustment made with deliberate precision, each movement unhurried and controlled. He considers the nature of the stitch that will follow, recognizing that even tension at this stage will ensure a consistent pull when the sinew is threaded through. There is no need to force the material into place. The hides will settle naturally under the weight of the stones, the fibers aligning themselves through gentle, sustained pressure. The rhythm of the placement becomes a quiet anchor, a steady pulse that matches the slow breathing of the camp. The workspace remains undisturbed, the secured seams waiting for the next phase to begin.
The final alignment check focuses on the transition points where multiple hides will converge, ensuring that the overlapping sections create a smooth, continuous curve without abrupt angles or tension points. The man kneels beside the central joint, his hands resting lightly on the leather, feeling for any subtle variations in thickness or density. He presses gently along the seam, moving from the outer edge toward the center, his fingers tracing the natural grain of the material. The leather yields evenly, conforming to the pressure without resistance or stiffness. The tactile feedback is consistent, a uniform coolness and firmness that confirms the successful alignment of the hides. He adjusts a single stone near the center, shifting it slightly to the left to balance the tension across the overlapping sections. The sound of the stone sliding across the leather is a soft, quiet scrape, followed by a gentle settling as it finds its new position. The air around the workspace remains cool, but carries a faint warmth from the morning sun, which now strikes the ground with a pale, even intensity. The man's hands continue their methodical inspection, each touch deliberate, each movement unhurried and precise. He considers the long hours of stitching that lie ahead, the repetitive motion of the awl and thread, the gradual joining of separate pieces into a single continuous shell. There is no urgency, only the quiet certainty that the foundation is secure, that the seams will hold, that the shelter will take shape through steady, unchanging work. The workspace remains still,
the secured hides resting quietly under the weight of the stones, waiting for the owl to begin its quiet rhythm. The awl rests in the man's hand, its weight balanced and familiar, the bone handle smoothed by years of careful use. The tool is fashioned from the dense, curved rib of a mature bison, its tip ground to a sharp, precise point on a flat river stone. The man positions himself beside the aligned seam, his posture steady, his breathing slow and even. He places the tip of the awl against the leather, angling it slightly to follow the natural grain of the material. The first puncture is deliberate, applying steady pressure as the bone edge penetrates the dense fibers. The sound is sharp and clear, a quiet pock that echoes softly in the still air, followed by a faint rustle as the tip emerges on the opposite side. He withdraws the awl slowly, allowing the fibers to settle around the newly formed hole. The tactile feedback is immediate. The leather feels firm around the puncture, the edges closing slightly as the material retains its natural elasticity. He does not widen the hole or force the awl deeper than necessary. The goal is a clean, precise opening that will accept the sinew thread without tearing or distorting the surrounding fibers. The air around the workspace remains cool, carrying the faint scent of aged leather and the quiet warmth of the morning sun. The man's hands move with calm precision, each motion unhurried and controlled. He considers the rhythm that will follow, the repetitive sequence of puncture, thread, pull, and tighten, the steady progression of the seam from one end to the other. There is no need to rush. The awl will guide the thread will hold the hides together, the seam will grow through quiet, consistent work. The workspace remains still, the secured hides resting quietly under the weight of the stones, waiting for the thread to begin its quiet passage.
The second puncture follows the same careful sequence, placed approximately a hand's width from the first, maintaining a consistent spacing along the seam. The man positions the awl at the same angle, applying steady pressure as the bone tip penetrates the leather. The sound is identical, a sharp, clear pock that fades quickly into the still air, followed by the faint rustle of emerging fibers. He withdraws the tool slowly, his movements deliberate, his focus entirely on the immediate point of contact. The tactile feedback is consistent. The leather feels firm around the hole, the edges closing slightly as the material retains its natural elasticity. He checks the alignment of the two punctures, ensuring that they are evenly spaced and directly opposite one another across the seam. The texture is uniform, smooth and cool, with no visible distortion around the openings. The air around the workspace remains still, carrying only the faint scent of dried leather and the quiet warmth of the morning sun. The man's hands continue their methodical work, each puncture made with deliberate precision, each movement unhurried and controlled. He considers the nature of the thread, recognizing that the strength of the seam depends on the even distribution of tension
across each stitch. There is no need to force the material. The awl will create the path, the thread will follow, the seam will grow through quiet, consistent work. The rhythm of the punctures becomes a steady pulse, matching the slow breathing of the camp. The workspace remains undisturbed, the secured hides waiting for the next phase to begin. The third puncture completes the initial sequence, establishing a clear pattern for the stitching process. The man positions the awl once more, angling it carefully to match the previous openings. He applies steady pressure, feeling the bone tip glide through the dense fibers before emerging on the opposite side. The sound is sharp and clear, a quiet pock that echoes softly in the still air, followed by the faint rustle of settling material. He withdraws the awl slowly, his movements deliberate, his focus entirely on the immediate point of contact. The tactile feedback is consistent. The leather feels firm around the hole, the edges closing slightly as the material retains its natural elasticity. He inspects the spacing, running his fingers lightly along the seam to confirm that the 3 punctures are evenly distributed and perfectly aligned. The texture is uniform, smooth, and cool, with no visible disruptions along the joint. The air around the workspace remains cool, but carries a faint warmth from the morning sun, which now strikes the ground with a pale, even intensity. The man's hands continue their methodical work, each puncture made with deliberate precision, each movement unhurried and precise. He considers the long hours of stitching that lie ahead, the repetitive motion of the awl and thread, the gradual joining of separate pieces into a single continuous shell. There is no urgency, only the quiet certainty that the foundation is secure, that the seams will hold, that the shelter will take shape through steady, unchanging work. The workspace remains still, the secured hides resting quietly under the weight of the stones, waiting for the thread to begin its quiet passage. The prepared sinew thread is drawn through the eye of a bone needle, its length extending smoothly from the spool, pale and slightly glossy from the retained moisture. The man positions the needle at the edge of the first puncture, angling it to follow the natural curve of the seam. He applies gentle pressure, guiding the tip through the dense fibers of the leather. The sound is soft and muffled, a quiet shh pull as the needle slides through the hole, followed by the faint rustle of the thread emerging on the opposite side. He draws the thread through slowly, allowing the fibers to settle around the passing material without resistance or distortion. The tactile feedback is steady. The sinew feels cool and slightly resilient, offering gentle friction as it moves through the puncture. He does not pull excessively or force the thread faster than the leather will allow naturally. The goal is a smooth, even passage that maintains the integrity of both the thread and the hide. The air around the workspace remains still, carrying only the faint scent of dried leather, and the quiet warmth of the morning sun. The man's hands move with calm precision, each motion unhurried and controlled. He considers the rhythm that will follow, the repetitive sequence of puncture, thread, pull, and tighten, the steady progression of the seam from one end to the other. There is no need to rush. The thread will follow the path created by the awl. The hides will draw closer together. The seam will grow through quiet, consistent work. The workspace remains still, the secured hides resting quietly under the weight of the stones, waiting for the next stitch to begin. The second passage follows the same careful sequence, the needle guided through the adjacent puncture with the same steady, deliberate motion. The man positions the thread at the edge of the hole, angling it to match the natural curve of the seam. He applies gentle pressure, feeling the needle glide through the dense fibers before emerging on the opposite side. The sound is soft and muffled, a quiet shh pull that fades quickly into the still air, followed by the faint rustle of the thread settling into place. He draws the material through slowly, his movements unhurried, his focus entirely on the immediate point of contact. The tactile feedback is consistent. The sinew feels cool and slightly resilient, offering gentle friction as it moves through the puncture. He checks the alignment of the two stitches, ensuring that the thread lies flat against the leather without twisting or bunching. The texture is uniform, smooth, and cool, with no visible distortion around the openings. The air around the workspace remains still, carrying only the faint scent of dried leather and the quiet warmth of the morning sun. The man's hands continue their methodical work, each passage made with deliberate precision, each movement unhurried and controlled. He considers the nature of the tension, recognizing that even pressure at this stage will ensure a secure hold when the thread is tightened. There is no need to force the material. The needle will create the path. The thread will follow. The seam will grow through quiet, consistent work. The rhythm of the passages becomes a steady pulse, matching the slow breathing of the camp. The workspace remains undisturbed, the secured hides waiting for the next phase to begin. The third passage completes the initial sequence, establishing a clear pattern for the stitching process. The man positions the needle once more, angling it carefully to match the previous openings. He applies gentle pressure, feeling the thread glide through the dense fibers before emerging on the opposite side. The sound is soft and muffled, a quiet shh pull that echoes softly in the still air, followed by the faint rustle of settling material. He draws the thread through slowly, his movements deliberate, his focus entirely on the immediate point of contact. The tactile feedback is consistent. The sinew feels cool and slightly resilient, offering gentle friction as it moves through the puncture. He inspects the spacing, running his fingers lightly along the seam to confirm that the 3 stitches are evenly distributed and perfectly aligned. The texture is uniform, smooth, and cool, with no visible disruptions along the joint. The air around the workspace remains cool, but carries a faint warmth from the morning sun, which now strikes the ground with a pale, even intensity. The man's hands continue their methodical work, each passage made with deliberate precision, each movement unhurried and precise. He considers the long hours of stitching that lie ahead, the repetitive motion of the awl and thread, the gradual joining of separate pieces into a single continuous shell. There is no urgency, only the quiet certainty that the foundation is secure, that the seams will hold, that the shelter will take shape through steady, unchanging work. The workspace remains still, the secured hides resting quietly under the weight of the stones, waiting for the thread to begin its quiet passage. The final assembly of the frame begins in the late afternoon of a day when the prairie wind moves with a steady, unbroken force across the open grassland. The poles, now thoroughly dried and lightened by days of vertical seasoning, rest in a loose bundle near the edge of the camp circle. The man selects the 3 primary foundation poles first, verifying their straightness by running his hand along the length of each trunk. The surface is smooth, cool to the touch, and carries the faint, dry scent of cured pine resin. He positions the butt ends on a flat patch of earth, aligning them in a wide triangle that mirrors the natural distribution of weight across a standing base. The tips remain together, lashed securely with braided bison sinew that has been allowed to dry and shrink, tightening the knot into a rigid, unyielding apex. He stands at the center, placing both hands against the bound tips, and begins the slow upward lift. The poles rise as a single unit, their weight distributed evenly across his shoulders and palms. There is no sudden movement, only a gradual, controlled elevation until the tripod stands fully vertical, its legs spreading outward to form a stable, 3-pointed structure.
The sound of the wood settling into the soil is a low, muffled thud, followed by the quiet creak of the sinew lashing, adjusting to the new tension. The wind continues to pass through the tall grasses, but the frame holds steady, rooted by the careful balance of its geometry. The man steps back, observing the alignment, ensuring that the crossing point remains level and the base spreads evenly. There is no need to adjust further. The structure has found its natural equilibrium. The air around the tripod remains cool, carrying the dry, mineral scent of the prairie soil and the faint, resinous aroma of the seasoned wood. He returns to the remaining poles, lifting them one by one and sliding them into the spaces between the primary legs, adding mass and stability to the circular framework. Each pole is placed with deliberate care, its tip resting against the bound apex, its butt anchored firmly in the earth. The rhythmic sequence of lifting, positioning, and settling continues until the full conical shape emerges, a skeletal outline of the shelter waiting for its covering. The work proceeds without interruption, guided by repetition and the steady cadence of placement. The frame stands complete, silent and unchanging, ready for the next phase.
The second phase involves securing the base of the poles to prevent shifting under sustained wind pressure. The man gathers a series of thick, hand-carved wooden stakes, each approximately 18 inches in length, tapered to a blunt point to avoid splitting the dry prairie soil. He kneels beside the first pole, positioning the stake at a slight outward angle against the trunk, and strikes it with a smooth, heavy mallet fashioned from a dense oak limb. The sound is a dull, resonant thud, a low-frequency impact that travels through the ground and into his knees. He drives the stake until it sits flush against the earth, then repeats the process for each leg of the structure. The sequence is methodical, moving clockwise around the structure, each strike measured and consistent. The tactile feedback is steady. The wood of the stake meets the packed soil with a firm resistance, settling into a secure position without buckling or sliding. He checks the tension by pressing lightly against the frame, feeling the even distribution of force across the base. The wind shifts slightly, moving from a straight cross flow to a gentle diagonal, but the structure remains immobile, anchored by the carefully placed stakes. The air grows cooler as the sun begins to lower, casting long, pale shadows across the prairie. The man stands slowly, brushing a fine layer of dry soil from his trousers, and steps back to observe the completed framework. The conical shape is uniform, the poles evenly spaced, the base secure against the ground. He considers the weight of the hide covering that will soon be drawn over this skeleton, recognizing that the stability of the base will determine how evenly the tension distributes across the seams. There is no urgency to proceed. The frame will wait, steady and unchanging, while he prepares the covering for the final lift. The camp remains quiet, the only movement coming from the slow drift of grass seeds across the open ground and the distant, low hum of wind passing through the sage. The work continues in its own unhurried time, guided by repetition and quiet attention. As the light softens into the pale gold of early evening, the man prepares the final adjustments to the frame before introducing the cover. He moves to the apex, checking the sinew lashing for any signs of loosening or uneven tension. The braided cord remains tight, its fibers compressed by days of drying, holding the poles together with a quiet, unyielding strength. He runs his fingers along the crossing point, feeling the smooth, cured texture of the wood beneath the binding. The tactile sensation is consistent, firm, and cool, with no visible gaps or misalignments.
He shifts his attention to the lower sections, running his hands along the inner surfaces of the poles to ensure there are no rough spots or protruding knots that might catch or tear the hide. The wood is uniformly smooth, the result of careful scraping and seasoning, its surface polished by the dry winds and the repeated handling of the preparation process. He steps inside the frame, his boots settling softly against the packed earth, and looks upward toward the bound apex.
The converging lines of the poles create a narrow, focused opening to the sky, a deliberate design that will allow smoke to escape while keeping the interior sheltered from rain and wind. The thought arises that this space, though empty and open to the air, already holds the shape of a home, defined not by walls, but by the careful arrangement of wood and tension.
He exits the frame, his movements slow and deliberate, and gathers a small bundle of dry sage and cottonwood bark to place near the base, a quiet preparation for the evening fire that will eventually burn within. The air around the structure remains still, carrying the faint, clean scent of dried grass and seasoned pine. The man sits on a low wooden stool beside the frame, watching the slow descent of the sun and the gradual lengthening of shadows across the prairie. The work of the day is complete for now, and the structure will stand ready for the final covering, waiting for the next phase to begin. The weight of the hide cover. The prepared hide cover is laid out on a flat, dry area near the base of the frame, its edges carefully aligned and secured with smooth, flat stones to prevent shifting in the rising wind. The leather is thick, cool, and uniformly softened by weeks of stretching, fat application, and smoking. Its surface carries a subtle, warm sheen, the result of repeated brushing and the natural curing process, and it releases a faint, clean scent of aged leather and dried wood smoke when disturbed. The man approaches the cover slowly, his hands resting lightly at his sides, observing the way the material settles against the earth without wrinkling or folding. He begins at the rear seam, where the hides have been stitched together into a continuous curved panel. He places his fingers along the top edge, gripping the leather firmly but without excessive tension, and lifts it slowly from the ground. The material rises with a soft, muffled rustle, its weight distributed evenly across his hands and forearms. He carries it toward the base of the frame, positioning it so that the seam aligns with the rear opening. The wind catches the lower edge, causing a brief, gentle flutter before the leather settles back into a steady downward pull. He does not fight the movement. He allows the air to guide the material into place, stepping back slightly to let the natural weight of the cover begin its descent along the poles. The sound of the leather moving against the wood is quiet and continuous, a soft shh rustle, that repeats as the cover slides downward, following the conical curve of the frame. The tactile feedback is steady. The leather feels cool and slightly resilient, conforming to the shape of the poles without resistance or distortion. He moves around the structure, adjusting the lower edges as they reach the ground, ensuring that the cover hangs evenly on all sides. The process is slow and deliberate, governed by the steady pull of gravity and the careful guidance of his hands. There is no rush to complete the task. The cover will settle into its final position gradually, aligning the fibers with the frame through quiet, consistent movement. The air around the workspace remains cool, carrying the faint scent of dry soil and the clean, aged aroma of the leather. The man continues to adjust, his hands moving with calm precision, his focus entirely on the immediate contact between hide and wood. The structure begins to take on the familiar, rounded shape of a completed shelter, the open framework gradually disappearing beneath the continuous panel. The work proceeds without interruption, guided by repetition and the steady rhythm of placement. The cover settles into place, quiet and unchanging, ready for the final securing.
The second phase focuses on securing the cover to prevent it from shifting or billowing in the sustained prairie wind. The man gathers a series of thin, flexible wooden pins, each approximately 6 inches in length, carved from supple willow branches and sharpened to a blunt point. He moves along the lower edge of the cover, lifting a small section of the leather and pressing it firmly against the ground. He inserts the first pin at a shallow angle, driving it through the hem of the cover and into the packed soil. The sound is a quiet, muffled thud, followed by the faint rustle of the leather settling against the earth. He repeats the process at regular intervals, spacing the pins evenly around the entire perimeter. The tactile feedback is consistent. The leather yields gently to the pressure of the pin, the fibers compressing slightly without tearing or stretching. He checks the tension by running his hand along the secured edge, feeling for any loose sections or uneven pulls. The texture is uniform, smooth and cool, with no visible gaps or wrinkles along the base. The wind continues to pass across the prairie, but the cover remains firmly anchored, its lower edge held in place by the steady distribution of the wooden pins. The man moves to the rear opening, where the leather is designed to remain unsecured for entry and ventilation. He folds the overlapping seam inward, creating a tight, controlled flap that can be adjusted according to the direction of the wind. The sound of the leather folding is soft and muffled, a quiet shh click as the edges align and settle into place. He steps back to observe the overall alignment, ensuring that the cover hangs evenly from the apex to the base without sagging or pulling too tightly.
The conical shape is complete, the seams flush, the tension distributed uniformly across the entire surface. He considers the weight of the material, recognizing that the secure base will allow the upper sections to remain flexible, shifting slightly with the wind without compromising the integrity of the structure. There is no need to rush to the next step. The cover will rest, anchored and steady, while he prepares the interior space. The camp remains quiet, the only movement coming from the slow drift of dust across the open ground and the distant, low hum of wind passing through the grass. The work continues in its own unhurried time, guided by repetition and quiet attention.
As the evening light deepens into a pale, muted blue, the man completes the final adjustments to the exterior cover, ensuring that every seam and edge rests evenly against the frame. He moves slowly around the structure, his hands resting lightly on the leather, feeling for any areas where the tension may be uneven or where the wind might catch a loose fold. The tactile feedback is consistent. The leather feels cool and firm, its surface smooth and slightly resilient under his touch. He presses gently along the rear seam, adjusting the overlapping flap to create a tighter seal against the incoming breeze. The sound of the leather shifting is soft and continuous, a quiet rustle that fades quickly into the still air. He steps back once more, observing the completed exterior, noting how the conical shape holds its form without sagging or distorting. The wind continues to pass across the prairie, but the cover remains steady, its lower edge firmly anchored and its upper sections following the natural curve of the frame.
The air around the structure grows cooler as the sun disappears below the horizon, but the interior remains sheltered, protected by the continuous panel of cured leather. The man gathers a small bundle of dry kindling and cottonwood bark, placing it near the rear opening in preparation for the evening fire. He pauses briefly, resting his hand against the cool leather, feeling the quiet stability of the structure beneath his palm. The thought arises that this space, though still empty and open to the night air, already holds the shape of a sanctuary, defined by the careful arrangement of materials and the steady passage of time.
He steps inside, his boots settling softly against the packed earth, and looks upward toward the bound apex. The converging lines of the poles create a narrow opening to the sky, a deliberate design that will soon allow smoke to escape while keeping the interior warm and dry. He returns to the exterior, his movements slow and deliberate, and waits for the final phase to begin. The structure stands complete, quiet and unchanging, ready for the first embers to be lit within.
The preparation of the interior fire begins with the careful selection of dry, seasoned wood gathered from the previous day's collection near the edge of the camp. The man kneels at the center of the teepee floor, arranging a small pile of fine twigs and shredded cottonwood bark in a loose circular pattern. The bark is pale and fibrous, catching the low light of the evening sky with a soft, matte texture. He places the material on a shallow, flat stone to prevent the heat from scorching the packed earth beneath, a simple precaution that preserves the ground and contains the ash. The tactile sensation of the bark is light and brittle, crumbling slightly under the pressure of his fingers, releasing a faint woody scent that blends with the clean, dry air inside the shelter. He adds a second layer of thin, split branches, positioning them at opposing angles to create a stable base for the initial flame. The sound of the wood settling against the stone is quiet and muffled, a soft click, followed by a gentle rustle as the pieces align into a balanced arrangement. He does not pack the material tightly. The gaps between the branches allow air to circulate freely, ensuring that the fire will catch quickly without smoldering or producing excessive smoke. The wind outside continues to pass across the prairie, but its sound is muffled within the shelter, reduced to a low, steady hum that moves along the outer leather surface. The man remains still, observing the arrangement, ensuring that the structure is balanced and ready for the spark. He reaches into a small, cured leather pouch at his side and withdraws a piece of iron pyrite and a flat, dried piece of fungus, the traditional tools for creating a slow, controlled ignition. The tactile feedback is steady. The iron pyrite feels cold and dense, its surface rough and slightly metallic, while the fungus is dry and lightweight, crumbling easily at the edges. He places the pyrite on the flat stone beside the kindling, positioning the fungus directly over the center of the pile. The workspace inside the shelter remains quiet, the only movement coming from the slow settling of the wood and the distant, muffled sound of wind passing through the grass. The preparation is complete, guided by repetition and quiet attention. The materials rest in place, ready for the first strike.
The ignition process begins with a single, deliberate motion. The man holds the pyrite firmly in one hand and a smooth, hardened piece of chert in the other, angling the stones to create a sharp, glancing impact. The sound is a quick, metallic click, followed by a faint shower of tiny sparks that scatter downward toward the dried fungus. He does not strike repeatedly. He allows the first impact to settle, observing whether the sparks have caught on the fibrous surface. A small orange ember begins to glow, slow and steady, spreading gradually across the center of the fungus.
He places a thin, shredded layer of bark over the ember, folding it gently to enclose the heat while still allowing a small amount of air to enter. The sound of the bark settling is quiet and muffled, a soft rustle that fades quickly into the still air. He waits, his hands resting lightly on his knees, observing the slow growth of the ember as it spreads into the surrounding material. The tactile feedback is steady. The bark feels cool and dry, but a faint warmth begins to radiate upward as the fire takes hold. He does not blow or disturb the arrangement. The fire will catch naturally if the air circulation remains balanced and the materials are sufficiently dry.
The ember grows slowly, spreading into the fine twigs, then into the split branches, producing a quiet, continuous crackle as the wood begins to burn. The sound is low and rhythmic, a steady pop and hiss that repeats as the moisture in the wood evaporates and the fibers ignite. The air inside the shelter grows slightly warmer, carrying the clean, familiar scent of burning cottonwood and dried bark. The man steps back slightly, allowing the fire to establish itself, his focus remaining on the steady progression of the flame. There is no need to rush or adjust the arrangement. The fire will burn steadily if left undisturbed, guided by the careful preparation and the balanced airflow. The interior space remains quiet, the only movement coming from the slow rise of smoke toward the apex opening and the distant, muffled sound of wind passing outside. The work continues in its own unhurried time, guided by repetition and quiet attention. As the fire establishes itself, the man adds a few larger split pieces of seasoned lodgepole pine, placing them carefully against the base of the flame. The wood is dry and light, its surface carrying the faint, resinous scent of the same trees that form the frame of the shelter. He positions the logs at opposing angles, creating a stable platform that allows the heat to circulate evenly without collapsing. The sound of the wood settling is a soft, muffled thud, followed by a quiet crackle as the heat reaches the new material. He remains seated beside the fire, his hands resting lightly on his knees, observing the steady progression of the flame as it moves upward and outward. The light inside the shelter grows warmer, casting a pale golden glow against the inner surface of the leather cover. The smoke rises in a slow, steady column toward the apex opening, dissipating into the cool evening air without accumulating or thickening. The tactile sensation of the heat is gentle and consistent, warming the air without becoming oppressive, creating a quiet, contained atmosphere that contrasts sharply with the cool, moving air outside. The man considers the long evening ahead, recognizing that this fire will require only occasional adjustment, a steady presence that will maintain the interior warmth through the night. He reaches into his pouch and withdraws a small, flat piece of dried sage, placing it near the edge of the fire, where the heat will slowly release its aromatic oils into the air. The scent is clean and herbal, blending with the wood smoke and the dry prairie air to create a quiet, familiar atmosphere. The interior remains still, the only movement coming from the slow rise of smoke and the gentle flicker of the flame against the leather. The wind outside continues to pass across the prairie, but its sound is reduced to a low, steady hum that moves along the outer surface of the cover. The shelter holds its shape, steady and unchanging, a quiet sanctuary against the cool evening air. The work of the day is complete, guided by repetition and quiet attention. The fire burns steadily, the interior remains warm, and the space waits for the night to begin. The fire is lit now, low and steady, its light settling into the leather walls of a home shaped entirely by one pair of hands, working alone across the length of the spring. The same hands that chose the wood also scraped the hide, twisted the sinew, and raised the poles against the sky. Nothing here was rushed toward. Each task was simply allowed its own time until it was finished. Outside, the plains hold their long quiet under the cold spring sky. Inside, the air is warm. The smoke rises without urgency toward the opening above, and the sound of wind against hide has softened into something almost like breathing. The work is done, and the one who did it has gone still, resting beside what his own patience built. Wherever you are, you can rest now, too. There is nothing further to follow, nothing left to hold on to. Let the stillness of the finished house settle over you, and let the last of your thoughts dissolve into the quiet, unchanging dark.